Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amplifying Voices on Turtle Island, an intersectional caucus. Thank you for joining us for BIPOC Health Matters, pushing the boundaries of health equity. My name is Shayna, and I am the Director of Community Relations and a board member of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Before I get started with this panel, we would like to acknowledge that BLM Sudbury is located in Swakamook, later known as Sudbury. This land on which we learn, work, and live is located on the traditional lands of the Tikmishing Anishinaabeg and the Wanapitei First Nation in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. We'd also like to recognize the presence and important contributions of Métis people in the community and on this land. Here at Black Lives Matter Sudbury, we recognize that reconciliation does not begin and end with a simple land acknowledgement. We must work to actively decolonize spaces and uplift Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. In addition, we must all aid in the ongoing battle for Indigenous sovereignty, access to clean drinking water, and seek justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and two-spirited individuals. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that February marks Black History Month. While oppression, discrimination, and systemic injustices cannot be diminished to just 1 month a year, it is important to recognize this time as an opportunity to educate yourself, your family, and your friends on the historic contributions of Black communities on Turtle Island. We would also like to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. It is because of their generosity that we have been able to thrive and present important programming like this caucus within our northern community. Biographies of our panel participants and a full list of our conference sponsors can be found on our website, www.blmsudbury.ca. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation for each panel, provided by the Interprétation Signes et Paroles à ISEP. Following this panel, all attendees will receive a feedback survey that can be filled out for a chance to win a prize pack of items, including the caucus logo, designed by Raven DeBosky. This logo expresses the power and connection among marginalized individuals across Turtle Island. The art depicts the interconnection between humanity and nature, and the woodland stylization and vivid colors aim to celebrate the solidarity among Indigenous and Black communities. Our moderator for this panel is Robin, a member of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Our panel consists of Dr. Jennifer Jocko, Dr. Angela Robertson, and Dr. Che Birchwood. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And without further ado, here is your moderator, Robin.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very, very much for attending. I'm extremely happy to be moderating this panel. Once again, my name is Robin, also Rasheen Robinson. I'm finally in my last semester of nursing school in Sudbury. And I'm very excited to interact with members of the healthcare system and who want to be a part of this discussion regarding dismantling health inequities. So without further ado, we are going to dive right into it. The first question, I've framed in a way so that each member of the panel can also give a little bit of background information regarding their work in healthcare. So it's open to anybody. Can you speak about your work and background in healthcare, bringing to light the inequities that you have recognized in the Canadian healthcare system? If nobody wants to go first, I can just simply choose. I see Angela smiling there. So Angela, I'm going to choose you.
it's always who is on first. So again, Angela Robertson, I'm really happy to be part of this really wonderful conversation and convening. And as you know, I sit here in Toronto in terms of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nations. It is an absolute privilege to be here in terms of locating myself as somebody who is an immigrant to this country and part of the ancestors of the transatlantic slave trade, really as a stolen person to these stolen lands. Always continually reminding myself and each other that coming through this history 500 years later, that we're compelled to be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples' fight for land sovereignty and rights. So as in the context of this conversation, I want to frame some of my comments anchored in the quote of James Baldwin when he talks about, in this particularly this Black History Month, that history is not past, history is the present, that we are present, that we carry our history with us, and that we are our history. And in this particular moment, I think for me, my work has really been about spotlighting and centering and addressing racism and inequality as a Black woman, as a member of the queer community, and as an immigrant in this country, and as a worker in the healthcare system, that I see the work that I do as responding to both the personally and the structurally mediated sites of racism and how it manifests itself, and as well thinking about the fact that in healthcare and elsewhere that we really need to center the response and a response to racism, and particularly in healthcare, racism and its biological consequences, because racism we know produces ill health. And for me, in this moment, this pandemic moment, I have seen that in how Black folks, BIPOC folks have been adversely impacted, higher rates of COVID, lower rates of vaccine access, addressing the issues of vaccine hesitancy, and that has been a backlash because the hesitancy has not been anchored with our experience of structural and historical and contemporary racism, and how that needs to be manifested. The other piece that I also want to kind of frame in terms of the work that I bring as well is that how health is connected to all of the other sites of material deprivation, that we cannot talk about health just in the biology. We must also talk about the social determinants of health. And really lastly, the work that I do is also around supporting folks who are substance using. And I know that harm reduction and the harm reduction work has been largely a white-led network, but yet we know that BIPOC, particularly Black and Indigenous bodies, have been on the harsh receiving end of criminalization of people who use drugs, and also disproportionately impacted by overdose events and the poison drug supply. So really, kind of those are the pieces that I bring and want to bring to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We're gonna move on to, I don't know between Jennifer or Shay, which one wants to go first. It's up to you guys. Okay, we can go with Jennifer. I'm just gonna go based on who I see first.
Sure. I always hesitate to go first, always. Quick way, Ani. Thank you for having me today. In addition to the land acknowledgement, I like to frame it from how is the land helping me? I wanted to acknowledge that the land that I'm on and how it's actually transforming some self-care for me, and providing for my family. So the meat in our freezer comes from my traditional hunting territories in Pikwakanagan. I am originally from Pikwakanagan, my family is. The fish that we have in our fridge comes from the fish locally. So the lands and the waters provide us nourishment, but also I live near the water and I use it. I try to, well, except when it's frozen, be around it, be near it. And it certainly helps to quieten the thoughts of the last couple of years, especially, more so because of COVID. The woods that we cut to provide fire for our sacred fires, the fires that I have around full moon ceremony, or sometimes just a fire I need to sit around to, again, quieten the thoughts or to talk about my thoughts into the fire, it's providing me strength and a direct almost a direct, we'll say, direct path to the Creator, and helps me in, kind of realign my own medicine wheel. So the land certainly has been very helpful to me, and so I wanted to acknowledge it in a different way. But I do appreciate Shayna, how she, we are more, as Indigenous people, we are more than just a checkbox. For the BIPOC community, for Black Indigenous people, we are more than just a checkbox, just similar to the land acknowledgement. It's more than just a checkbox at the beginning of a session. So that I wanted to say that was really timely. So I am a practicing obstetrician gynecologist here at Health Sciences North. I practice in Sudbury, both the community practice. Also, I work at an Aboriginal Health Access Center downtown Sudbury. I also work and provide care to people on the island. So I go to the island once a month, so that people don't need to drive so far to see me. I have a half-day clinic I do in Wiki, Wacomico First Nation, and working as an Indigenous person in this field, just in the structure of the hospital. Dr. Angela talks about the systemic issues that, social determinants of health that we've learned. But when I think about the inequities in our health system, I think about my experiences as an Indigenous person and a physician, and the inequities that I have seen firsthand in patients that didn't want to come to the emergency department, and I have to talk into going to the emergency department, or talk into staying overnight in the hospital, where the word on the street is we're not welcome here. I work at the Eastern Door, so I welcome life into the world. And so I endeavor to try to make each person that I am fortunate to become involved in their journey, to be that friendly face, hopefully, whether it's at the Eastern Door and welcoming life, or again, someone in the emergency department who might need an operation. I try to be that person for them. Unfortunately, this is a very white space, and it always has been. And the colonialism that has happened, or colonization, I should say, we see it every day. And it's the first 6 months of COVID. By September 11th, actually, I brought together all of the hospital administration with some help from some allies, including Angela Recollet, who's the executive director of Chicago McQuay, and a dear friend and warrior sister, and other warrior sisters in the region. We all came together because of too many, just too much. We see too much, and I felt that it needs to be addressed. And how do you address it in this white place as you go to the top? But it's not really just about administration, it's all levels of the hospital. And so I led a sharing circle, and that was 2.5 years ago, or just over, not quite 2.5 years ago. And I put my heart on the line, and I'm still struggling with that, because I don't know that it did much, to be honest. It's very tough to work here sometimes.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. I know that was very emotional. This will be a very hard panel for me personally as well, to navigating the healthcare system as a healthcare student as well too. I have seen and discovered so much in my in the past few years being a part of this industry, and so I really am looking forward to learning from you guys and your motion, and already what you've shared Dr. So with Dr. A lot of doctors here, Dr. Birkwood, why am I saying that correctly, or Birchwood?
Birchwood, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Birchwood. Okay, you can go ahead. Thank you, and I apologize for the mispronunciation. Same question that I posed to, if I'm just to reiterate, background about you and your work in relation to the health inequities that you find in the Canadian healthcare system.
Yeah, so Dr. Che Birchwood, I am a psychologist, licensed psychologist in Quebec. Recently, I finished my PhD in July, so it's a relatively new thing for me to be a doctor, but I've been working in mental health and social services for 15 years. My second job was working with children in foster care. And so all through my studies, and I have always worked in mental health and social services. In terms of racial and other inequalities, there's so much in all the different fields that I've worked in. There's always inequalities. That's our society is structured around inequalities, and it feeds itself on that. So, but definitely when I worked with children in foster care, the children that I worked with, the agency that I worked with, all children were First Nation, Métis, or Inuit. But children, like Indigenous children, are disproportionately taken from their homes. Black children are disproportionately taken from their homes. Indigenous and Black ways of parenting are often critiqued, and because they, I guess, deviate from the norm, it's easier, also with layers of racism and stuff like that, it's easier for them to say that the child isn't being raised right. Well, I just said it because they weren't raised white. So I saw it there when I worked in crisis intervention. I saw it, I worked in crisis intervention for 3 years, and I saw the racial and class inequalities there, and how healthcare workers can be very mean to people in mental distress, very callous and cold. And there was also a racial element to who gets sympathy, who gets empathy, and what kind of support people get. And then racial inequalities in my schooling. I was actually talking to my dad yesterday, who's also a psychologist. And I was saying that when I applied for grad school, they kept on asking for my immigration papers. I'm born and raised in Winnipeg. I'm a Canadian citizen. I've never had any other kind of citizenship, but the admissions person asked me 3 separate times for my immigration papers. And even while she was holding my Canadian birth certificate in her hand, she's asking for my immigration papers. So right from my first interaction with that university, I experienced like racial microaggression, and I can only imagine, like, I'm a pretty strong-headed person, so I just kind of gave her the eyes and kept on chugging. But the same thing happened in my schooling. I was consistently marked lower than other students. I get really great feedback from clients. Clients will say that I'm the best therapist that they ever worked with, but I'll get a B- from my clinical supervisor. So there are just racial inequalities all over the place, and every type of work that I do, even in community organizing. I specifically organize events, QT BIPOC events, and always have like space. I put on all the events. If you can't afford the cover charge, just message me and we'll figure something out. But yeah, the same inequalities that we experience in everyday life replicate themselves in the healthcare system, in all forms of healthcare, including now in psychotherapy. There's so few Black psychologists, so few Indigenous psychologists. Part of it is just getting through the schooling is really, really hard. It's, you know, it's hard on your mental and physical health just to deal with these racist microaggressions over and over and over again. One Black student that I started my PhD with, after the first year she quit and she went back to Haiti just because she just couldn't take it anymore. So there's high demand because of racism and all the discrimination and violence that Black and Indigenous people have to deal with. There's high demand for psychotherapy. Like, there's a lot of Black and Indigenous and other racialized people that are looking for mental health support, but there's so few therapists, psychologists, social workers, everything there to provide those services. So even before I graduated, I had a wait list. So it's just like high demand, low supply, intentionally keeping people from graduating these programs. And then it just becomes this cycle of people needing care and not being able to access it. And then them being blamed for having mental health difficulties, having relational problems, using substances or things like that to deal with mental health issues because they're not able to access support. So I also teach, I give a lot of conferences and speak on panels like this about race and mental health and the interplay between them, and how the racism and other forms of discrimination we experience make a home in our bodies and basically kind of poison us. And so looking at the interplay between emotions and mental health and physical health.
Thank you very much. All of you have given extremely good answers to the first question and good insight on your background as well too, which I highly appreciate. I'm sure our attendees appreciate as well too. We're going to get into the next question here that both Dr. Robinson and Dr. Jocko had both touched on, which was regarding the current COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't know if anybody wants to, both Dr. Jocko and Dr. Robinson want to add anything more, but the question I want to pose essentially is, obviously all of us are aware of the pandemic and how it's impacted most people globally. However, we have seen marginalized communities suffer the most. So COVID-19 has really shown the disparities in the care for BIPOC communities across our province. And I would like to know what has been your response to this, or what does this mean for you? Once again, anybody can go first, but maybe we should just go in order that we started off with. So we'll come back to you, Dr. Robertson, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to answer by echoing from Dr. Jocko's comment and around the personal impact that it takes, that the work that I think we do here and how we come to the work isn't the work is over there and life is over here, is that the work, our lives depend on what happens in this work, and the life of the people who we belong to and whose communities we have affinity with depend on the work. So therefore, there is a different weight that I think, an urgency. So for me, in this COVID moment, in terms of some of the things that I think we have seen is we've seen in this pandemic work and workplaces that many of us BIPOC populations work in predominantly deemed essential in the height of the pandemic, and therefore warranting enhancements around wages and some levels of protection. And what we have seen is the quote unquote going back to normal is going back to a place where those inequalities were present, where we were not essential, where we were not warranted these wage enhancements, and or I would say not even wage enhancements, pay for the work that we actually do, and protections in the workplaces where we work. So in this moment, there's a piece for me around leaning in to make sure that some of those things that were enabled during this pandemic continue in this thing called recovery. The other piece that I would say in this moment as well is a lot of the work that I do here in Toronto through the center is supporting folks who are unsheltered and folks who are homeless. And in Toronto, where I am, 30+% of the folks who are in the homeless sheltering system self-identify as Indigenous, and over 30% as well self-identify as Black. So therefore, for me, in this pandemic moment, and in the context of recovery work, is housing is an anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism strategy. So it is imperative that I and our communities demand that these national housing strategy is not just general for the general population, but it really seeks to hone in on the sites of the people who are facing the greatest and fearing the worst in terms of disparities, sites of disparity. The other piece that I have, that I've seen, and it's just been beyond annoying, is that during this pandemic, I have heard and sat at tables where many leaders have identified that, and these are leaders who, after the murder of George Floyd, and in the wake of anti-Indigenous racism consciousness, where people have made public statements. Everybody has put out a public statement of solidarity on their corporate websites and or within their teams. Yet these same leaders within the system have said that, we can't boil the ocean. And this is when we come to responding to issues of inequality and addressing and ameliorating and redressing is, well, really, we can't boil the ocean. We need to remember that we cannot do this thing called equity because it would slow everything down. We need to respond to the concerns of the general population, and then we will do equity. And the general population always read white, yes? And then as well, the comment that it's inefficient to do the equity strategy is that we need to do population first, because we're in a moment of crisis where timeliness is needed. And if we include equity, it will take too much time. So I think that wherever you are, for the folks who are in the audience, is that wherever you are, there's a certain urgency in pushing back against all of those kinds of comments. And as we kind of move into this thing called recovery, we cannot let the systems and the various places where we work and where we convene in community and that are traditionally, institutionally based, go back to the quote unquote normal. And that really the work right now for me is about interrupting. It's about interrupting, it's about being insistent, and it's about, using the John Lewis quote to the civil rights activist, it's about making good trouble. And that this is a moment where we need to just be relentless in making good trouble. And for folks with little places of privilege where we sit and have voice, is that we need to risk doing that, because that must be the purpose and mission. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for that, Dr. Robertson. We're going to go to Dr. Jocko, if you have anything else to share regarding how health inequity has really showcased throughout this pandemic that we're facing.
Well, I like that good trouble, Dr. Angela. But the only problem with that good trouble is this, where in order to exist, in order to function, and carry around this backpack of everything. It's hard work when there isn't enough of us. And that's a challenge because I say no to things. I have to say no to things for me because of what happened 2 years ago. I feel that I am not ready to cause good trouble. I am trying to I have a colleague here. She's also a good friend, Sister Warrior, who spoke with me at that sharing circle. She has more of an administrative aspect to her role. Dr. Kona Williams, the first and only Indigenous forensics pathologist in Canada, is a very good friend of mine. I send emails to her. I'm like, I volunteered you for this. I volunteered you for that. She is a great sister warrior. But yeah, so it's good trouble is great, but it's also challenging when there's very few of us. And I've said this in other settings and other panels where, and even to hospital administration at a meeting before, I said there needs to be more of us sitting where you are. There needs to be more of us sitting in management, in administration, but not just there, but in all levels of institutions, education, policing, everything. There needs to be more of us to make that good trouble because we're much stronger together. The challenges of COVID-19, and the highlights of how the BIPOC population are unfortunately highlighted in not a good way, is a lot of it is based in mistrust of, well, you should do this because it's good for you. When back in, a lot of the residential school systems, many things unfortunately were studied, nutritional studies, things like that. Horrible. Don't really want to go there, but so there are generations, it's generations of mistrust of this is good for you. So I myself, with working with the communities that I'm able to work with on a one-to-one basis, is how I help people to understand that this is not a bad thing. COVID is a bad thing for us. And when many First Nation communities were almost first in getting access to vaccinations, and many reserves had their 2 vaccinations quite early on in the pandemic, was a small victory, I felt like. We have, though, a very large urban Indigenous population, but our Chicago-McQuay did really push to become here locally one of the main supporters and drove people to a weekly vaccination clinic that was led by people from Chicago-McQuay. The arena would be smudged. There was drum going. It made it feel like a good place. So again, I'm really trying to focus more on the positive than the negative, and that was a positive that came out of it. And it's still going on weekly. Every Wednesday it's a Chicago-McQuay led vaccine clinic that I encourage all Indigenous BIPOC people can go to. And it's a much more welcoming space because it feels like our space, even though it's in a big arena. But yeah.
I love that. Thank you very much, Dr. Jocko. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm sorry. You guys are all doctors. Dr. Birchwood, you can go ahead next. Pretty much just once again, reiteration of the question, how has COVID-19 somewhat showcased the health inequities that we face in BIPOC communities?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's high demand. There's always been, but especially during COVID and especially after the murder of George Floyd, I got a surge of racialized people wanting to talk about race, specifically consulting for feelings around race. The other things I noticed is that a lot of the high-risk jobs are worked by Black people. So at least in Montreal, all the security guards at hospitals, at stores that are the first contact, making sure people are wearing masks, making sure they're sanitizing their hands. I've noticed like 95% Black people doing those kinds of jobs, but you're the first contact. So someone's going to come in without a mask and then you have to tell them. So you're going to get exposed to COVID more often, and then you're also exposed to more violence from people who don't want to follow the rules and regulations. And same thing with like, we call them préposés aux bénéficiaires in French. I guess unit attendants, or nurses' aides, again, disproportionately Black in Montreal. But and people were saying that if the people are asylum seekers and they're doing this job, they should be getting citizenship. And the Premier of Quebec was like, no, you know? So we see Black bodies as being essential, but not desired, not protected. So we're essential if we're going to sacrifice ourselves. If we put ourselves in harm's way, then we're essential because we're protecting other people. So that's what I've noticed a lot in the pandemic. Us being really on the front lines, and when you get sick, when you're doing those kinds of jobs, there's no sick leave. You know, like, yeah, we have universal health care, but there's no sick leave. Like, you can't work, you don't get money. If you don't work, sometimes your citizenship is put into jeopardy as well. So there's layers and layers to it. In terms of doing the work, working from home really blurred those lines. Obviously, I'm not a doctor in the health sector. I'm in private practice, and immediately starting to practice psychotherapy in my home, it really brought my clients' lives into my life, and there was a lot of blurred lines. I was having like dreams about things that clients would tell me, and obviously I hear a lot of trauma, a lot of really intense trauma stories, and having that in your home. Obviously there's empathy. I always had empathy, but it made it very personal, and it was you couldn't get away from it in some ways. So I've had to adjust my practice a lot to be able to, and do a lot extra work to be able to have some sort of differentiation and take care of myself, because yes, we're healthcare workers, we're providing a service, we're helping, we're taking care of people and keeping them safe, but we're experiencing the same things that they're going through. All the stress and uncertainty and fear, and you know, we're experiencing that too. So we have to do an extra layer or few layers of work to be able to feel okay enough to go and then help people, you know? So you have to really put your life and all your problems on pause and really focus on the person, but then do so much extra care work on to, you know, just get better enough so you can go back and do that work again.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. We are about a few minutes until we start answering some questions. Granted, they come in. However, I have been updated that we have not received any questions as of yet. So we are going to continue with the discussion because we've only answered 2 questions. There's 4 questions in total. However, we've kind of answered all of them in slight ways, but we're going to continue. Okay. So next, which we did slightly touch on, but to hear some more insight would be wonderful. The question is now, health equity is now professed goal of many working in health sectors. We have seen a rise in cultural sensitivity training and attempts to mitigate racism within the clinical setting. What is your idea of true equity, and how do we push the boundaries of the health equity narrative so that it is not just a course people take and leave behind? And Angela, you can go first.
Thank you. So I think for me, in terms of the idea of pushing the boundaries of the health equity narrative, I think about a few levels. I think one is around, in this moment, it's around having BIPOC folks be employed in good jobs across the spectrum of spaces in our healthcare system. Largely, we have been relegated to sometimes only in the admin support functions, in the custodial functions, in the frontline, and initially it wasn't even in frontline nursing. It was the nursing aide and or the personal support worker. It's a funny thing that in the moment where we see a lack of capacity in terms of numbers of nursing who are leaving the profession because of burnout, because of exhaustion, it's at this moment when we have heard that, well, we're going to now enable foreign trained nurses to be invited fully into the system when those nurses have been knocking at the door, and when we know that Indigenous nurses in this country have been less than invited into the nursing quote unquote fraternity. So one for me is around the representation across the spectrum in the system, and not just in the diversity equity portfolios that have been created in this moment. So that's one piece. The other piece for me is that Canada has long, through its multiculturalism narrative, sought not to speak to and own and acknowledge and then act to address and redress the impact of racism and colonization. And that I think in this moment for me is that, one, the naming of the presence and the impact, both the structural and the personally mediated impact of racism, is something that all institutions must do, because if not, then it's left to those of us who experience it at the psychic and physical level to be always on the front line, being asked and commanded to be the audience, to speak to the impact of racism. And I think racism just doesn't impact me as a Black woman in this space. Racism impacts white folks. Racism is about white folks. White folks need to be talking about racism and what needs to happen to address what they benefit from around racism. So there's a piece for me around this moment, around turning that narrative about who gets to have the burden of addressing the racism issues and the manifestation of those problems. And then I would say that lastly, I now have oftentimes what happens is when there is a response, a visceral response and a speaking back to racism by Black, BIPOC, Indigenous populations, is we get small chunks of money thrown at us in project grants and initiatives to lift up pilots. And while we need to have resources to build evidence, to build innovative programs, is I now push back against that, those what I see as the crumb offering. I see this moment for me is around addressing the business of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism is the system's business. So the system must embed resources that names that as a site, as a problem, and then attach resources in the system to address it, and not to break it off and hive it off and give it to racialized BIPOC communities to say, here, deal with it, and then 5 years later, the problem still exists, and then you turn around and you tell us, well, we gave you $25 million last year. What did you all do to solve this problem? When you haven't made it the system's business. So I want the solutions really to be the system's business and not just my burden to carry. So that's just a bit of a personal tirade.
I agree. Thank you. Dr. Jocko, any thoughts?
Mic drop.
All right.
No, just amazing, Dr. Angela. Both of you articulate things so much better than I do. I think I wear my heart a little bit too much on my sleeve. But in speaking to, I think also the fundamental approach here is humanizing. We need to be humanized. We need to be visual. We need to be seen as the same, not the same. Well, our lives aren't valued. I had a conversation with a colleague, and we're talking about the trucker convoy, whatnot. And there was an argument, not an argument, but she had made a statement of, oh, Jennifer, something this or that, this is not, it's kind of wrong, but, and I was, oh dear, just a minute. And I said, if we had done that as a people, it wouldn't have lasted this long. It would have been much more bloodshed. And that is because we're valued as less. The pipeline with Wet'suwet'en people, women and children, elders being thrown to the ground. And here the predominantly white people putting their children, I could go on, but when I, at an individual level, am needing to, and I didn't really realize what I was doing, but when I am bringing someone here that I want to help them to get into labor and, bring life into the world, I talk to the desk, the nurses, and I tell the story of this person and their family. And it only because I would be bristled sometimes by a response from them that I could see that, oh, they don't value this person as they would anybody else. So I have been, in all of my 8 years, humanizing my patients with people by telling their stories to nurses, to my colleagues, to humanize that person and that family so that they could see that they have value. And telling their stories makes them more, I would hope, and my use of it, I guess, was or is making them feel that they are of value. And I didn't realize that until the last couple of years that someone actually called that out and they said, that's what you're doing. Is you were telling a story to humanize them. And I think that's the basis of health equity, is once we are valued just as anyone else, then that's where, I think we can start to work from.
Yes, agreed. Thank you very much for that. And Dr. Birchwood, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question to answer. So
right.
In the past year, like I said, since the murder of George Floyd, I've been highly solicited, not just for psychotherapy, but to give trainings, anti-racist trainings, especially in community organizations. I still get a lot of contacts to give workshops on anti-Blackness and what people can do. And EDI became this buzzword, just repeated over and over and over again, and it's everywhere. So I would accept, because I'm not in a financial position to not take money that's offered to me, but I would tell them straight up right at the beginning of the workshop is that I'm not here to make you not racist. I can't do that. I can't make someone not racist. I can give you information about racism. I can tell you the psychological underpinnings of racism, why it's there, how it's perpetuated, the impact on people. And then it's up to you to be not racist. You could take that information and ignore it, or you can take that information and do something about it. And enact reparations in your own life. You know, you don't necessarily need a whole system to work to show reparations to Black and Indigenous people. You can do that in your interpersonal relationships. And that's really where it starts. Like, macroaggression, systemic discrimination happens because of microaggressions and interpersonal discrimination and violence. So the people, these admin people or university deans, all that kind of stuff, the people that are high up, they're people. So if they have interpersonal biases, then that system is going to have interpersonal biases. So I do like this kind of almost one-on-one, or like, you know, working with a group of 10, maybe 20 people, in the hopes that it will kind of, you know, it'll expand, and one person tells another person who tells another person, and the information shared, and that it will have an impact. But also the bad part of my work is I never know. I don't get the follow-up. I don't know if it does have a long-term impact, if it does actually change something within that institution. But I still try. I have some hope that, like, even if it's just 1 or 2 people per workshop that start changing their behavior and start seeing Black people as, and Indigenous people as people, and understand how horrific their ancestors were to us, and how that continues to perpetuate to this day, and how the violence that we experience creates mental health conditions that further demonize us. So when I talk about anti-Blackness, I talk about intergenerational trauma and how that makes a home in our bodies, and it changes our DNA. And I talk about the window of tolerance. So window of tolerance is this emotional range in which you feel comfortable, you can deal with things, you can adapt to any challenges that come up. What happens with trauma is your window of tolerance shrinks. And the more trauma you experience, the smaller and smaller your window of tolerance becomes, and it gets easier to be in hyperactivation, which shows up as anxiety, anger, aggression, a lot of externalizing. And it's easier to go into hypoaggression, which often shows up as depression, sometimes laziness, being unmotivated, things like that. So simply being Black and Indigenous and experiencing discrimination shrinks our windows of tolerance, and that causes us to behave in certain ways that are then stereotyped and say, like, oh, well, Black people are lazy, look at this, you know, or Black people are violent or aggressive. Look at this one person's behavior, but it was caused by racism, if they even are. The other thing I do when I teach about anti-Blackness is I talk about how all stereotypes against Black people are actually psychological projections that come from the racist person. Black people aren't disproportionately violent. You can see that in statistics, and you can see that historically. Black people weren't kidnapping children. Black people weren't throwing babies overboard because they were crying too much. Black people weren't stacking people on top of each other or locking them in boxes. That wasn't Black people. We're not the aggressive ones here. It's a projection. It's a psychological projection triggered by shame. And I have to call that out in order for people to start absorbing the information and start looking at themselves and being like, okay, yeah, it's not white guilt. White guilt, I wish we had white guilt. It's really white shame that is driving these things. And by calling out shame, it helps reduce it. So what is true equity? Of course, being humanized and being seen. Is that fully possible for people who have been trained to dehumanize us? You know, I say like intergenerational trauma is passed down, but so is intergenerational dominance. Like that's not, that becomes a family trait that gets passed on through generations and generations. So we're dealing with the consequences of slavery and colonization, but like Dr. Robertson said, white people are also dealing with it. And it's up to them to confront racism and change racism. It really is up to them. The work really should be on them, but the ideas of what the work needs to be comes from us.
Yes. Oh my gosh, very good. Thank you for all the insight from all three of you. We actually do have 3 questions here and 10 minutes of time. So the way that maybe I want to try to attempt to frame this is ask a question and maybe one person answer, then go on to the next, another person, if you feel comfortable doing so, just so we can kind of get it all in there. Okay. The first question that we have is from Cecilia, and she's asking, what would you say to young BIPOC healthcare students walking into the field? What are some ways to take care of yourself while doing this work, especially during a pandemic?
Yeah, I feel I can answer that.
Go ahead, yeah.
Especially since I just finished being a student. Find friends, find other people in your field before you even apply. Find other racialized people, other Black people, other Indigenous people in your field, connect with them before you apply to help you decide what school to go to and applications and dealing with that whole process. I know that if I didn't have a mentor, a Black psychologist mentor, I would have dropped out. There were so many times where I was very, very, very close to quitting. But I had this mentor being like, this is how you deal with this situation within the university institution. It's hard now, but once you're done, you'll be able to really make those changes. And if I didn't have a mentor, if I didn't have some peers, I wouldn't be a doctor right now. That's really safe to say that. And I think the thing that's really important is to know yourself really well. Start therapy before you go into school. To get to know yourself, but also so you already have a support system there. Because university is a violent place in general. Like part of my research is on student mental health, and the statistics are not good. Like my research was based on statistics in 2016, and 52% of students almost met criteria for depression, for clinical depression at my university. And that was before the pandemic. That was 4 years before the pandemic. So have friends, have colleagues, a support, have therapy, whether that's massage therapy, psychotherapy, healers. Know yourself and know what you need to take care of yourself, and try to build a community of care. You know, where when you're depleted, you have someone else that can care for you, and vice versa. Like I had COVID in March 2020. I developed pneumonia, and it was really scary. I lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, and it was really scary. And if I didn't have friends who could activate themselves and who had cars who could bring me groceries, I literally would have starved. You know, I needed a thermometer to monitor my temperature. And if I didn't have a friend who came the same day to bring one to me, you know, who knows what would have happened. So even if they're not in your field, honestly, just having this core community of care, it will save your life.
Thank you very much for that. The next question that we have is from Facebook, from Monique. And it is, sorry guys, healthcare is being privatized gradually, but definitely happening. In your view, how was that impacting BIPOC communities specifically?
I can answer that probably. Well, there's many threats of privatization, and we already have a two-tier healthcare system, really. Well, the challenges with something like that is we become even more, we become even less of a priority in that system because we can't afford it. That's the biggest thing, right? And the work that we do and the work that our people do often don't have benefits and whatnot, access to third-party insurance coverage that may actually be able to access that private healthcare. And already we have our healthcare that is the pocket of money that it comes out of is the federal money, and it's disproportionately, sliced off into, dental and whatnot. And already we don't, despite being a status Indian in the eyes of the government, I can't get a root canal if my life depended on it. And oftentimes a root canal does. And people cannot afford the $1,000 dental bill. So you end up with less teeth, which a lot of my family can attest to. So it already exists. I think we really have to push for it not to. There's one of the resolutions that my partner came up with was, let's just make our own hospital. I guess that's yeah, and we fill it with our people. And then we know that we're going to someplace safe. And so I think that I often thought it was a pipe dream, but you never know. But yeah, I think it would be very unfortunate if they really did fully privatize healthcare, because it's only going to benefit the people who can afford it, because we cannot.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Jocko. We are actually about to wrap things up. It was my mistake. I thought we had 3 questions. We only had 2. So we finished at the perfect time. This pretty much concludes our discussion and our panel. It's been an amazing discussion, an amazing hour with you people. And I'm really grateful once again for being here, for moderating this panel, learning, and also facilitating the learning of other people who have attended. So thank you once again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Sunday evening.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you all so very much for this amazing panel. It was so great to hear from all of you and for cultivating this amazing, exciting discussion. I sincerely hope that everyone enjoyed themselves. As a reminder, keep an eye out for our follow-up survey and an opportunity to be entered for a chance to win a prize pack of items, which includes a caucus logo designed by Raven Dubosky. Thank you so much for joining us for this year's caucus, Amplifying Voices on Turtle Island, an intersectional caucus. For intersectional caucus information, please consult our website and stay tuned to our social media, www.blmsudbury.ca. Thank you again to our sponsors, Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association, Sudbury Manitoulin, Centre de santé communautaire de Grande Sudbury, the Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Collège Boréal, Future North, Futur du Nord, Galerie du Nouvel Ontario, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Mental Health and Addictions Program of Health Sciences North, the Nickel Refillery, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, Réseau Access Network, HIV, Hepatitis, Health and Social Services, Services Sociaux et de Santé pour l'Hépatite et le VIH, Sudbury Action Center for Youth, SACY, SACY, Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Center, SWEAC, SWEAC, and YWCA Sudbury. On behalf of the members of the board of Black Lives Matter Sudbury, I'd like to thank everyone for for attending our second virtual caucus. There are a number of folks I need to thank for all their work on this caucus, who you may not have been able to see on screen, but who are definitely making or made this happen. So I'd like to thank AJ, Neil, Cecilia, Everest, Shala, Tel, Lauren, Akili, Elsa, Isaac, and of course, Rana. Without the hard work of these unpaid volunteers, none of this would have been possible. Thank you all so much. Everything that you do to make these voices come to light has been so impressive and so amazing. And it's been my pleasure to work with all of you continuously through Black Lives Matter Sudbury. We do this work from our hearts, and I'm so thankful that we could share this with our communities. Footage from this weekend's event will be available on our Facebook page and through our YouTube channels in the coming weeks. Thank you again to our sponsors, our panelists, our moderators. Without your support, events such as these would not have been possible. So connect with us via media at BLM Sudbury or visit our website, blmsudbury.ca, for organization updates or to volunteer with our team. Stay tuned for BLMS's exciting upcoming initiatives, like our newly bilingual virtual museum for Black history, and many more things to come. You gotta wait for it. It's gonna be awesome. In the spirit of the conference theme, amplifying voices on Turtle Island, I wanna say, stay loud, stay proud, and our voices will be heard. Thank you for joining us, and have a splendid rest of your day. Miigwech, thank you. Au revoir, merci.